So finally, chapter 15 on the monopoly. We'll be covering a few things here. Let's go over that. So we've already talked about why monopolies arise, right? There's some sort of barrier to entry. We'll give some examples of that in a bit, but you should already basically have a good understanding of that. We'll get into understanding why for the monopolist, marginal revenue is actually less than price. Remember, for the competitive firm, they're equal. But for the monopolist, that's not the case. It is the case that the money coming in at the margin, marginal revenue, is actually less than price. And you'll get a good understanding of that by looking at a table where we'll compute total revenue and then also marginal revenue. And then we're going to have the monopoly optimize. In other words, choose their optimal quantity and choose their optimal price. And it's similar to the competitive story or the competitive industry because it's still going to be that they want to equate marginal revenue to marginal cost. But they are price setters, they are price influencers because they're the only provider in the market. So we're going to ask, well, where would they want to set the price? We won't talk too much in this video on how monopolies affect society's well-being. We'll touch a bit on the deadweight loss, but in terms of the public policy towards monopolists, that's what you're going to read on your own because, again, it's one of those things that's super duper easy to read. Okay. We'll touch a bit on price discrimination. At this level, at the introductory level, it doesn't get too into price discrimination. And in other words, charging different prices to different people for either for different reasons. We'll give a few examples. So monopoly, you know what that is already, right? There's only one seller of the good in the market. And remember, this is the complete opposite of the competitive structure. And of course, the big difference is that the monopolist can influence price, right? They are a price setter, meaning they have market power, rather than a price taker. And so why do they arise? As I said earlier, there are barriers to entry, right? So there tends to be three sources. One, a single firm owns a key resource, right? So they own the resource that's necessary in order to produce whatever it is that needs to be produced. A good example, as I mentioned before, is De Beers. They used to own most of the world's diamond mines, and I'm sorry, you can't harvest diamonds, not at least not the natural ones, if you don't have diamond mines, right? So they had control of this key resource. Two, it could be that the government creates a monopoly by assigning exclusive rights, like with patents or copyright laws or permits. Okay. And then the third one is what we call a natural monopoly, and we've talked about this before, where it makes sense for there only to be one firm because that one firm can provide all the output to the market, right? And they can do it at a lower cost. In other words, they're operating on the part of their average total cost curve where it's actually decreasing rather than where it's increasing. So I think I gave you the example where I was drawing a really bad drawing. I think my example was cable, but here we have electricity, right? If there's 1,000 homes that need electricity, we only need one firm to come in. We don't need another firm to come in and incur this huge upfront cost just to service one home. Okay, so that's an example again of a natural monopoly. And again, a natural monopolist, the beauty of being a natural monopolist is that you're operating on the downward part of the average total cost curve because we know that it does ultimately come back up, right? Because ATC is U-shaped as we learned in chapter 13. But for the natural monopolist, it is the case that one firm can service the entire market. In other words, also on the downward part of their average total cost curve. So notice that all 1,000 homes here can be serviced by this one firm, and in particular, it's on the lower part of its ATC curve. Again, that's what's called a natural monopoly. Utility companies tend to be natural monopolies. Okay. And so if we had, this is a good example, right? If we had two firms servicing them, each of them 500 and 500, the average total cost of production would actually be higher in that case. All right, so monopoly versus a competitive firm. I emphasized this last time. I'm going to emphasize it again, that for the competitive firm, the demand curve that the competitive firm faces is this horizontal line. It is perfectly elastic, meaning very, very sensitive to price changes. Why? Because the market's super competitive. If this farmer tries to charge anything higher than the going price, then buyers, demanders would not want to be part of this, would not consume from this firm, right? So again, a competitive firm faces a perfectly elastic demand curve. And they can charge, as long as they charge that price, let's say we call this P0 here, P naught, they can sell as much or as little as they want, because it's so competitive that they're only taking a part of that whole big market, right? So as long as the price is right, meaning as long as they charge the right price, then sure they're going to sell it. Demand will be defined for them. But for the monopolists, they're the only player in town. So they face the entire market demand curve. So if you're writing this down right now and you're drawing this P and Q and then the demand curve, I would in subscript here write market. That this is the market level demand curve. The monopolist faces the entire market demand curve. And because it faces the entire market demand curve, marginal revenue is not going to be equal to price. This is a big difference between the monopolist and the highly competitive firm. And to get at why this is not the case, and not only that marginal revenue is not equal to price for the monopolist, but it's also less than price everywhere except for that first unit. Let's use a table to understand that. So remember I told you before that I don't care too much about average revenue? You can look at it if you want, but to be honest, it doesn't really do much. In other words, we don't get too much economic insight here. And so let's find marginal revenue, and of course we need to find total revenue for each of these. So $0 here. If they price at $4.50, they don't sell any. If they price at $4, they're going to sell 1. If they price at $3.50, they're going to sell 2. So then combining these two pieces of information, by the way, these two pieces of information, you know it's the demand curve because as price drops, quantity increases, right? So if we plot this, we get a negatively sloped demand curve. And so let's fill in for total revenue here. Again, 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 250 is 10. And so this is total revenue. And sure, fill in average revenue, take the 9, divide by 3. Boring, who cares? Fine. We do end up getting that price is equal to average revenue here, but again, whatever, who cares? What I really want you to focus on is marginal revenue. Remember, marginal revenue is the additional revenue from providing that delta Q, that additional output. So revenue changes when you provide the first unit. Revenue changes by $4, right? So the marginal revenue of that first unit is $4. When you make that second marginal unit, the marginal revenue increases, is $3. And then when you make the third marginal unit, total revenue increases by $2, which means marginal revenue is $2. We do it every time. It increases by 1, then it increases by 0, then it actually goes down. And that is possible. That as you produce more, it could at some point turn marginal revenue to be negative. You definitely, as a monopolist, definitely do not want to be operating at the part of the demand curve where marginal revenue is negative, meaning you sell another unit and your total revenue actually went down. And you may say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Oh, yes, it does. We just computed it from here. We said compute total revenue and then take the change, right? Each time, of course, we're saying delta TR is 2 from 7 to 9. And then we're dividing by delta Q, and delta Q happens to be 1 in this case. It didn't have to be. If this were 13, our delta Q would have been what? 2 to 13, so 11? Did I do my math right? Yeah, if this were 13. Then we went from 2 to 13. That means the change in Q was 11, so we would have done 2 divided by 11. But that's not what we have. We have our delta Q here happens to be 1. Anyway, so I wanted to show you that everywhere except for that first unit, that marginal revenue is actually less than price. Right, for this first unit, there's marginal revenue that's equal to price. The next unit that's provided, the price is $3.50, marginal revenue is lower than it. The next unit, price is $3, marginal revenue is 2. Right, so marginal revenue is lower than price. The next unit, marginal revenue is lower than the price. Here's the price, there's marginal revenue. Here's the price, there's marginal revenue. So marginal revenue is going to be lower than price everywhere except for that initial marginal unit. And so if we plot this, we have our demand curve here, which is first column and second column information. And notice we have positive dollars, negative, and then here's quantity. And if you plot marginal revenue and this, we end up being here, right? It's plotted in the middle, by the way. You should know this by now from chapter 13, right? Plotted in the middle because it's like the marginal unit going from here to here, right? To make sure you do produce that. Kind of like midway, right? And so notice that for each unit, we have marginal revenue being lower than price. For this unit, marginal revenue, price, right? For this unit, marginal revenue, price. In other words, the demand curve is up here. So we just showed, I showed you here, this is $3 marginal revenue, price is $3.50 for the second unit. But at the margin, it brought in $3. Right? So again, marginal revenue is lower than price. So get used to that. Drawing the demand curve up above, marginal revenue inside of it, and marginal revenue can actually even be negative, as we just showed here. And I'm not going to focus too much on this. You can, the textbook gets into this a bit. Certainly you can go through that as well. But I want to go to this here on profit maximization. Remember, all firms, regardless of the degree of competition, want to maximize profits. And the optimal output rule to achieve that objective is to equate marginal revenue to marginal costs. So the monopolist will also want to do this. It's not just something that a competitive firm does, right? It's just the rational thing to do given the objective of profit maximization. And then after that, so this will identify the optimal quantity. Once the monopolist knows the optimal quantity, then that determines what price they can charge according to the demand curve. Because they can't charge a ridiculously crazy high amount. Let's say it's a diamond and they say, well, this diamond's worth $10 bazillion. Well, the market's going to be like, that's nice, but we're not going to pay that. Right? So yes, they can set the price, but monopolists are constrained by demand. And so here we have the demand curve. By the way, this is the monopolist story. Here we have the demand curve. Here we have marginal revenue, which we know it actually, remember, here it'll touch, and then it's inside of the demand curve, and then it could even go negative. In fact, let me go to the tablet, because I want you to see how I do this by hand. By the way, by the time we're done with this chapter, if you walk away thinking, geez, that was a breeze. Yeah, it will be, relative to the other chapters, especially chapter 13 and chapter 14, because you did all the hard work in those two chapters that once we get to this one, it's like, oh, wow, this makes a lot of sense. Again, assuming you've been studying. So for the monopolist, again, we're talking about a monopoly here. We have, I can use big Q representing the entire market, or little q, because actually for the monopolist, there's only one Q in town. So big Q is little q. Right? Why do I say that? Remember, the little q represented the firm, big Q represented the market. Well, there's only one firm in the market, so it's actually the same thing. All right, so I'm going to put dollar signs here because technically it is price, but it's also cost that we're going to plot, so I just put dollar signs. And let's show the market level demand curve. There it is. If you want to remind yourselves that that's the case, then fine, write market. And then we just showed a little while ago that for the monopolist, marginal revenue is inside of the demand curve, and it can even go negative. And this part of the marginal revenue curve, the firm would never want to operate there. It means that if it produces, it's actually losing money at the margin, and therefore if it had profits, it just shrunk its profits. Or if it had losses going into those units, it just made its losses worse. So it would never want to operate, over here, anywhere on that side. But I'm still going to draw it just to remind you that marginal revenue actually can be negative. And so then, we can put marginal cost like that. I'll just put it linearly like this to make it simple. And so the monopolist, again, wants to maximize profits, and the optimal output rule is to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And that's there, right? Where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And once it does that, again, that allows the firm to optimize, to choose its optimal quantity. I'll call it QM for monopoly. And how much a monopolist decides to provide to the market, that determines the scarcity of the good in the market. So the monopolist will set price according to what the demand curve lets it get away with. Imagine like the monopolist is like standing down here and looking up. Let's zoom in so we can see that this person is looking up. Maybe it's a girl. There. Topless, but she's wearing a skirt. No, I'm just kidding. No topless. Here we go. Oh my God, I don't know how to draw. Anyway, folks, I am the worst. Put a bow on. I don't know. Oh my God, I'm the worst. So a monopolist is down here looking up saying, okay, this is the quantity that's optimal for the monopolist to produce. And it's going to look up to the demand curve. And basically, if it could, it would ask it, hey, demand, what do you let me get away with? What do you let me get away with charging you? And the demand curve, if it could talk, it would say, this is the amount we are willing to pay given that QM is provided in the market. right? Given that that's the amount provided in the market, then the demand curve says if that's the quantity, then the willingness to pay is up here, PM. So that's exactly how the monopolist operates. The monopolist first chooses how much to produce by optimizing. And then given how much it chooses to produce, that's how it can determine price, right? Because if it provides more to the market, then the demand curve, I didn't mean to do it exactly where they intersected. I meant to do it like maybe here. Then the demand curve says we're only willing to pay that. Or if they provide this much, of course it wouldn't because we're in negative marginal revenue territory. But suppose they did, then the demand curve says they would only be able to charge that. Right? So again, the demand curve determines how much the monopolist is able to charge. And the monopolist isn't dumb. The monopolist is going to try to charge as much as it can possibly charge, right? It's going to try to charge what it can get away with charging. So once again, here we have the market level demand curve, the associated marginal revenue curve, and then marginal cost. The monopolist optimizes by producing where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's how it chooses the optimal quantity. And given the quantity it provides to the market, this is the price that it can get away with charging. So I'll call it PM for monopoly price, optimal monopoly price. And so this is the monopoly outcome. And the monopolist, again, notice, for the competitive firm, little q, we had cost curves here, right? And then remember this was marginal cost, this is marginal revenue, and also the demand curve, and also the price that it faces. And the firm would optimize. It takes the prices given, and then it determines how much quantity to produce. So again, the causal relationship is it observes price, and that determines how much it will produce. For the monopolist, that's not the case. For the monopolist, it's the other way around. They don't take price and then set quantity. They set quantity because they're the only player in town. They optimize, and that's how they choose quantity. And given this quantity, then they charge according to the demand curve, what the demand curve would let them get away with charging. Right? So again, the causation is different. The monopolist sets quantity, and then that influences price. Right? They choose their optimal quantity, and then that determines price. But for the competitive firm, they take prices given, and then they choose quantity. So causation goes in the opposite direction. Okay, what else do I want to say? Oops, I was trying to erase that. Let's see. Okay, yes, actually, there's something else I want to point out. So again, just get comfortable drawing this. What gets funky for the monopolist is, that demand curve and then marginal revenue, but just get comfortable with it. Right? Just do it over and over. Demand curve, $Q, marginal revenue. And then on top of that, it looks funky, but all we're doing, folks, is just overlaying the cost curves. We already know these cost curves. We learned them from chapter 13. If I take that cost curve and put it over here, you're like, hey, I already knew that. Right? All we're doing is taking this and putting it basically on top of it. Well, like that. Right? And then, of course, we have, let me take it out again just so you can see. In reality, if we add the average total cost curve to it, right, we know the average total cost curve intersects it at its minimum. And then, again, just take this and overlay it here. And it looks super complicated because, oh my God, look at all these funky curves. But folks, it's not. Take it in pieces. We studied this part already in chapter 13. This part right here, I lost the C there. This part right here, we studied it already, right? And so this shouldn't be any funkier to you. All we're really learning in this chapter that's new is that the monopolist is facing the full demand curve and that the marginal revenue function is inside of the demand curve. But other than that, we're just overlaying stuff we've already studied on top of the monopolist, right? So here's the monopoly with including all the cost curves, at least the average total cost and the marginal cost curve. I'm not including average variable costs because the monopolist chooses to be here, right? Because it's got a barrier to entry, and that barrier to entry allows it to charge a higher price, and it's not going to set the price at a point where it's losing money. And remember, the average variable cost curve, while it exists, it doesn't have anything to say really until we have to choose between producing at a loss or shutting down at a loss. That's the only time that average variable cost curve really says, hey, listen to me, listen to me. And so that's why I'm not even drawing it here. Okay, let me draw the monopoly outcome one more time without the ATC curve for a second. So here we go again. Market demand, marginal revenue, and I'll just write a linear marginal cost curve. The monopolist chooses to produce, it wants to optimize, and that's where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's how it identifies the optimal output for the monopolist. And then it asks the demand curve, hey demand curve, what can I get away with charging given that I'm only providing QM units to the market? And the demand curve says, we're willing to pay PM. And so this is something we've already come to this conclusion, right? That this is the monopoly outcome. I just want to add a little bit more intuition here. Notice that for the QM unit, the marginal cost of producing that unit is here. I'll say MCM, M for the monopoly, optimal monopoly quantity. And look at this. It is the case that price is above marginal cost. That's a big deal. For the competitive firm, remember for the competitive firm, comp for competitive, all firms want to optimize, meaning equate marginal revenue to marginal cost. That's profit maximization for any degree of competition. But for the competitive firm, it also happens to be the case that marginal revenue equals price. For every unit that they sell, they're always going to get the same amount. $6. $6. They'll always get the same amount. $6. $6. So this one here is because of competition. And so if you combine both of these things together, profit maximization and competitive markets, then we end up getting marginal cost pricing. Remember, this is from last time. So that's for the competitive firm. But not for the monopolist. Look, the monopolist is not pricing at marginal cost. Of course it's not. Why would it? If it has a choice to set the price, why would it ever price at marginal cost? Marginal cost is lower than price. So for the monopolist, again, we have equating marginal revenue to marginal cost. So this is monopoly. Monopoly. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But for the monopolist, remember, for any particular unit, like that unit, marginal revenue is lower than the price they can charge. So marginal revenue is, I guess, lower than the price they can charge. I wish that were right, but is less than price, right? So maybe I'll just write this. I'll say, but MR is less than price for monopolists. So then combine those two things together, we get that it must be the case, you know, if MR is less than price, if MR equals MC, and MR is less than price, this one's this one, this one is this one, then combine those two things together, we get that marginal cost is less than price. That's exactly what we see here. The monopolist loves this. It gets to charge above cost, above the marginal cost of production. That's a beautiful thing if you're a firm. Not if you're a customer. If you're a customer, you're like, no, please only charge me what it costs to produce. Charge the lowest price possible. Yeah, that's not going to happen. Not with the monopoly story. And so for the monopolist, again, marginal cost ends up being less than price, which is exactly what we see here. And this gap between the two is what we call the markup. This is the market power. I mean, the market power is the ability to set price, but because it can set price, it has the ability to set a price above marginal cost. That's an awesome thing for a firm, right? Don't you want to charge more than it costs you to produce that unit at the margin? So that is what we call, once again, the markup, right? The ability of the firm to price above the cost of production at the margin. In other words, above marginal costs. Let me redraw this curve one more time, or this outcome. So monopolist, $, market demand, marginal revenue, and Let me impose marginal cost being linear there just because it's easy to work with. And the firm optimizes, and I would choose this QM and this PM. That would be the monopoly, optimal price for the monopolist. And so I want to point out a few things. The monopolist does not have a supply curve, because remember what a supply curve is. A supply curve describes the relationship between price and quantity. At this price, here's how much they would provide to the market. At this price, here's the quantity supplied. At this price, here's the quantity supplied. The monopolist isn't facing a bunch of prices like this one or this one or this one. There is only one price, and it is not facing it. It is setting it. So there isn't a supply function. A supply function is saying, well, at all these different prices, here are the quantities we would provide. A monopolist has a supply dot, and it's right here. Because there is no range of prices. There's only one price that's optimal for them, and they get to choose it. So this is what we get, again, what we call a supply dot. Okay, so that's one thing I wanted to point out. Another thing I want to point out is that, remember, this is the price they can charge given that they provide QM units to the market. And remember, this is the markup, right? This is the marginal cost of producing the QMth unit. And so here we have the markup, the ability to, the gap between price and marginal cost, how far up away from marginal cost the monopolist is able to price at. Well, imagine that this curve were more inelastic, that demand were more inelastic. For example, it's insulin or it's a life-saving drug. Then this demand curve is likelier to be that steep, right? This is a more inelastic. I meant to say, imagine that this is more inelastic, like for a life-saving drug, less sensitive to price changes. Well, if that's the case, folks, and suppose this represents the marginal revenue function, or maybe that's not it, but still the marginal revenue function touches here, and maybe they touch way up there, these two curves, who cares? Okay, just so we can keep that same intersection. So pretend this is marginal revenue crossing through here, and look at what happens to the markup. Right, if this is MR, then the firm would optimize, choose this quantity, but they're not going to price here. They're going to price way up here. So the markup ends up being this big right here, this dark, bold pink line, right? That should make sense that the monopolist is able to charge a higher price further away from marginal cost when the demand curve is more inelastic. And this explains why, let me just draw the more inelastic demand curve by itself. This explains why, didn't have to cross through there, it just happened to, why some life-saving drugs are super expensive, like the EpiPen, right? They were charging $700 a pop. Folks, it doesn't cost them $700 to make it. The hard part was the research and development. That was the big fixed cost to develop that drug. Now, after the science is known, it costs them almost nothing to produce it. So what are they doing? They're charging super high, and marginal cost is down here, and then that markup is that big, right? That big. So elasticity, or lack thereof, definitely influences the ability for the monopolist to charge a higher price further away from marginal cost. In other words, it influences the markup. Okay, so those were a few things I wanted to cover. Let's go back to the slides. By the way, we're basically done with this chapter. We're just a few additional things I want to point out. And so now we can layer in the average total cost curve to help us identify profit. And so notice all we did is here we have our marginal cost curve and marginal revenue. The monopolist is optimizing by choosing to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That identifies optimal quantity. Given this optimal quantity, the monopolist is going to charge as high of a price as the demand curve will let it get away with. It can't charge too high of a price because then it's not going to sell that optimal quantity. So it's going to try to price it precisely here what the demand curve lets it get away with. And of course, in reality, it's fuzzy, right? In reality, there's noise. In reality, they estimate the demand curve. But in our classroom, we're going to say, nope, that's the demand curve. And the demand says this is the price that the monopolist can get away with charging them. And so with that information, right, we can say, well, the monopolist is producing QM. We can identify profit. We worked through this already in chapter 14. We need to know total cost. We know revenue is price times quantity. So revenue is going to be this big box right here, the PQ box, right? And we know from last time that total cost we can identify by finding ATC and multiplying by Q. Well, if this is the Q we're producing, average total cost of those Q units, you just go straight up to the average total cost curve, and that gives us the average total cost. So ATC times Q will be this lower rectangle. So if we take the big PQ rectangle, subtract from it the ATCQ rectangle, we're left with the monopolist profits, right? Monopolist profits are right here, right? The difference between price and average total cost up until the amount of units that they sell. Notice that that's this here, P minus ATC times Q. And if I distribute this Q, Q times P, that's total revenue, minus ATC times Q is total cost. So this equation is saying it's the area where total revenue minus total cost is, right? That's exactly what this equation is saying. Okay, so that was one thing, and I already talked about not having a supply curve. It has a dot, so we'll skip this. Okay, and then now this is one of the final things I want to talk about. The difference between a monopolist and a highly competitive market. Let's just make a simplifying assumption that marginal cost is constant. For every unit, it's the same regardless of which unit it is. So that's why we have a flat line here. And the monopolist, given that marginal cost curve, it's still going to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So that's here. Again, charge the price it can get away with charging. But what would be the case under the competitive outcome? Under the competitive outcome, we'd be here. Because remember, the competitive at the market level. If this is market demand and this is MC, we know that marginal revenue equals marginal cost for the competitive firm. And we also know that marginal revenue is equal to price. So we know that this is the price, that MC is the price because MR equals MC and MR equals P, therefore P equals MC. Right? So we did that on the tablet just a second ago. And so if this is price, price has to touch the demand curve. And where price touches the market level demand curve, that's the quantity that would be bought at the competitive level. So I want you to notice two things. That for the monopolists, they're charging a higher price than the competitive outcome. That's terrible for consumers. They charge a higher price. But not only that, folks, what else does a monopolist do? Not only do they charge a higher price than under competitive conditions, but they also produce less. So a monopolist has market power, and it creates inefficiency. We end up having dead weight loss because of this. You can read through this part, but let me point that out to you. Remember, let's go back to our regular marginal cost curve that we're used to drawing. In the previous one, we did it flat. So I basically showed you, hey, where marginal cost intersects the demand curve, that's the competitive outcome, right? I just showed you that with the previous example. And so that's the competitive outcome, again, at the market level. But for the monopolists, layer on the marginal revenue function, because the marginal revenue function is different for the monopolists than for the competitive firm and then the market. And so here's marginal revenue. The monopolist optimizes. This is where we end up, right? So we've already know this. Here's the price. Here's the marginal cost of producing the QMth unit. And look at what happens. They're charging a higher price, and they're producing less than we would get under the competitive outcome. Again, this is basically the previous plot, except I just made the marginal cost curve more realistic because of diminishing returns. Remember that? And so notice that for these units here between QM and QC, these are units for which some buyer out there is willing to pay. They value the good at more than it costs to make these units. This marginal cost is the cost of producing these units between QM and QC, exactly where I'm highlighting right here. And the units cost less at the margin, right, on the per unit. Each unit costs less to produce than the value that consumers place on it, the willingness to pay, willingness and ability to pay technically. So because the monopolist has market power, these trades between here and here aren't occurring. They would have been an efficient trade there as long as the price is right. The price can't be too high because the buyers won't buy. The price can't be too low, like here or here, because the price is lower than the marginal cost. The price has to be just right, meaning it has to be somewhere between here and here. All right, as long as the price is right, that they would want to trade between these units between QM and QC. But the monopolist is saying, I'm optimizing, producing this many, that's the price. Screw everybody else. So price is higher, quantity demanded goes down. And we end up getting these trades here not occurring. So what should we call this if these trades are not occurring? Why do we trade? We trade because we're better off. If we're not picking up that better offedness, it's deadweight loss. Right? We end up having deadweight loss because of the monopoly. And remember, we said that in chapter 4, or actually, I'm sorry, chapter 7, when I first introduced you to consumer, producer surplus, that sort of thing, I said assume the market can get to its happy place, meaning assume it can get to the intersection of supply and demand, then total surplus is maximized. Well, with the monopolist, it's not getting to the happy place. This is the happy place. Remember I kept saying that the supply curve is the marginal cost curve? So this is technically the supply curve for the competitive story, but it's not getting to the happy place right here, to this equilibrium, efficient outcome with the monopolist, because that's not optimal for the monopolist. The monopolist takes us away from there. And we learned in chapter 7, anytime we come away from this point, efficiency necessarily decreases, meaning we're going to have some deadweight loss. And that's exactly what we get here. Okay. Price discrimination is basically charging different prices to different people, either based on the people's characteristics or even based on the characteristics of a good. It could be like, well, this one has, it's in a smaller bag. Okay. So what? But for some reason, a 6-ounce bag versus a 12-ounce bag, or a half a pound versus a pound bag of peanuts. Because it's in a smaller bag, we're usually charged more. That's price discrimination based on the characteristics of the good itself, the good or the service. Or price discrimination based on different people. Younger people, like the movie tickets, right? Students pay a different fee than the general audience. Military also pays a different fee than the senior citizens, right? So it could be based on race or gender. It could be based on student status. It can be based on a whole lot of things. So again, basically selling the same good but charging different prices. Okay, and there is one example of when the monopolist can be efficient. It could lead to the efficient outcome, meaning total surplus is maximized. And that would be if we had what is known as perfect price discrimination. The monopolist can perfectly price discriminate, meaning they can identify every single buyer's willingness to pay. And because they can identify it, they charge them their willingness to pay. So you know how under the regular monopoly story, here's the MR equals MC, here's the optimal quantity, they get away with charging a price of PM. Well, if that's the price of PM, then this green box up here is consumer surplus, as you know by now because you're experts at it. And so that would be the consumer surplus. Producer surplus would be down here, actually this part here, and then that's deadweight loss, right? Well, this happens to be monopoly profit because we're assuming fixed costs are zero. Don't focus too much on that. If it perfectly price discriminates, it charges each buyer their exact willingness to pay. Then for this unit here, what do they charge the buyer? That price. For this unit here, what do they charge the buyer? That price. For this unit here, what do they charge the buyer? That price. For each buyer, they charge them their perfect willingness to pay, or perfectly charge them their willingness to pay. Then all of this ends up turning into producer surplus, in this case, monopoly profit, right? So the monopolist ends up taking us here. There is no deadweight loss. We do get to the efficient outcome, but there's no consumer surplus, right? Because the monopolist was perfectly price discriminating. In theory, it's easy to model, just like we just did. In practice, it's difficult to do, right? Because consumers aren't out there revealing their willingness to pay. It's not like the monopolist can be like, hey, you, Joe Schmo, what's your willingness to pay for this unit? Joe Schmo may say something, but he's going to lie if he's smart, right? He's going to go below his true willingness to pay. So anyway, in theory, we can get to the efficient outcome if the monopolist perfectly price discriminates. And remember, efficiency just means total surplus is as big as possible. It says nothing about the distribution of the slices. And in this particular case, the monopolist got all surplus. There is no consumer surplus. So yes, in theory, the monopoly outcome can be efficient. But in practice, again, it's difficult to do. Okay. Here are some examples. You can go through these on your own. Where are they? Here they are. And I wanted to get to this part here. Public policy towards monopolies. This is what you are responsible for. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this, but you are certainly responsible for reading this. You don't have, by the way, you don't have to memorize those dates. Just understand why they did what they did and what's public ownership, that sort of thing. What else do I want to talk about? That's it. We are done. Chapter 15 done. So pretty straightforward chapter. Make sure you work through the practice problems. It gets a little tricky when you actually have to compute this stuff. But go ahead and do that, and you should be well prepared for this upcoming exam when it comes to monopolies. Do not hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions, folks. But of course, don't wait until the night before or minutes and hours before something is due. Give yourself enough time. I hope you've enjoyed this class, and just keep it up. Keep, grinding through. And like I said, I hope you've enjoyed this class, and I hope that this far you found some of this information to be actually pretty informative as to how industry works and how the world works, and that you see it well beyond just, the monopoly producing widgets, that you actually see these things in action out there in the real world. Maybe they're not goods and services. Maybe it's just, instead of there just being, you talking about, one supplier, maybe it's that case of walking into a club and you're the only one there, and it's, you're the only one of a particular sex, and it's the other opposite sex the room is full of people of the opposite sex, assuming you like hetero relationships. Well, guess what? You have some monopoly power there, right? So yeah, it's a kind of a sick and twisted way of looking at things, but it does allow you to call the shots. Which reminds me, it should make you think about the degree that you're getting, right? And the skills that you're picking up. What's going to allow you to call the shots? What's going to allow you to negotiate your wages, your salary? It's scarcity, right? How scarce are you, right? How rare are you? And so, I don't know, I'm just trying to link it to things that actually matter to you, because we're, coming to the end here, and I don't get to see you in person, but I do want you to hopefully see the greater applications of this stuff that we talked about. Yeah, maybe not formally model something and formally, compute marginal revenue again ever in your life. Maybe not, because you're not going to go and pursue an econ degree, or maybe you're not a business major where you have to take the next level micro class. But you should still be able to see the implications and the consequences of scarcity and abundance, and what's efficiency mean and what's inefficient, and how that doesn't address the issue of equality, and right? So all of these concepts, just walk out your door, go interact with people, and you should be able to see a lot of these forces at play. Anyway, folks, good luck. Keep up with the good hard work that you're putting into this class, and I guess that's about it for this chapter.